Hello and welcome back to the MOOC for Masters on Academic Writing. My name is Jeremiah Hendren and I'm going to be telling you about the writing process today. I'd like to start with a quote from the famous author Isaac Asimov. "Writing to me is simply thinking through my fingers." Now this is the perfect frame to think about the writing process as a whole. Writing is not just about coming up with a final product, but it's actually a tool that you can use to figure out what you think about your topic. It's a tool you can use to get to that final product. The technique that I'd like to teach you today I call the 2.5 draft method, or simply put, make a mess, then clean it up. In the first step, you just want to get your ideas down on paper. I call this draft half because it's not really a draft. It's merely a process through which you get ideas from your subconscious mind into your conscious mind. You impress yourself with all the different things that you actually know about your topic, but you didn't know that you knew about your topic. This is the most effective technique that I know to get over writer's block. When people say they have writer's block, usually the problem is that they're trying to write a perfect draft right when they sit down at the computer. So this draft half is a technique to make sure you never have writer's block again. So what I'd like you to do in a minute here is pause the recording and do an exercise that I call focused free writing. Now some of you might have done free writing before, which is where you simply write whatever comes to mind for 10 minutes, for example. This is a similar exercise, but it's focused free writing because you're going to try to respond to a specific question. So what you're going to do is first take out a blank piece of paper, and then I want you to write your question of the day at the top of that paper. Now your question of the day could be a very broad question like this: how can I make my research findings interesting to a wider audience? Now this would be a good question for somebody who has already finished a thesis or a journal article, for example, but maybe they just got invited to present their findings at a conference and they need to submit an abstract about their findings, and they need to write this in a way that non-experts can also understand, just as an example. Your question of the day could also be narrow, something like this: why do I disagree with so-and-so's findings? So this would be a good question for somebody who is in the thick of their work, writing, in this case, the literature review section, and they already know that they don't really agree with the findings of another author, but they haven't figured out all the details. And so today they're going to get into all the details of why they disagree. Or you could also have a middle-sized question. For example, what are the merits of X versus Y methodology? Now this would also be good for someone who's already started writing their thesis or article or whatever the project is, but they haven't quite figured out how they're going to carry out their study. So they needed to choose the merits of one methodology over another. So I want you to just reflect on whatever you're writing on now and choose your own question of the day. Then you're going to set a timer for 10 minutes. And the only rule here is this: don't stop writing for the entire 10 minutes. Even if you only write, "I don't know what to say, this is a silly exercise, why is he making us do this," whatever. Look back at your question constantly and then always try to answer that from as many different angles as possible. And I promise you'll end up coming back to the question and writing something useful. So go ahead and pause the recording here and try the exercise. So welcome back. I'd like to share a little story about this technique. When I was writing my bachelor's thesis, my advisor taught me to do this, and for about 6 months, every single morning I'd wake up at 6 and sit down at my computer with a cup of coffee, write my question of the day, set my timer, and write. And I'll tell you, every day for 6 months I didn't want to do this, and every day for 6 months, when the timer went off, I didn't want to stop. I often ask my students in class to raise their hand if they didn't want to stop, and usually at least half of the students raised their hand, that they found maybe they thought the exercise was silly when they started it, but once they got into it, they wanted to keep going. And the reason is, this is a way to simulate a flow state. Usually when we talk about flow states, we think that just maybe 5 or 10% of the time when the sun's shining, we get into the flow. But if you want to be productive as a student or an academic, you have to be able to simulate the flow state, get into it anytime that you want. And this is a technique that lets you do that. I also always ask my students who surprised themselves with what came out of their pen in this process. And again, at least half of my students always raise their hand that they were shocked with what they didn't know that they knew, so to speak. And they were shocked at how this exercise helps bring such rich information from their subconscious into their conscious mind. So that's it for the draft half. We want to move on now to the first draft, which is where you're going to write out your text in a logical flow of ideas. This is the beginning of the clean it up phase of the writing process. An important point here is don't kill your rhythm. Don't suddenly invent reasons to have writer's block at this phase. You don't want to think at all about sentence construction yet, word choice, style, rhetoric, all these questions. That's going to come still later. You still just want to think about ideas. And I'm going to give you a practical technique to do this with the text that you just wrote. First, I want you to find a highlighter, or you could also just use a pen to underline if you like. And I want you to go back look at the text you wrote and highlight the important ideas or phrases. And then I want you to turn those highlights into 2 or 3 coherent sentences that answer your question of the day. So in the first phase, you were sort of vomiting out all your ideas, getting them onto the paper, and now you're cleaning it all up into coherent sentences that are a specific answer to your question of the day. So go ahead and pause the recording here and do this exercise. Okay, welcome back. So that was draft 1. Now moving on to draft 2. This is where you're going to polish your text following the principles of style. Now you haven't learned much about style yet, but this is going to come later on in this MOOC, where we'll talk about sentence construction and paragraph construction and so on. The important thing here is don't touch any of this stuff until draft 2, right? Until you're at the end of this process of getting your ideas down, pulling your ideas into a logical order. Only at that point do you want to think about the most appropriate style for how to present your ideas, and also to clean up all the, incorrect syntax or grammar that you might have, or, misspellings or whatever else. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the main causes of writer's block is that people try to jump into this step right away from the beginning. So just keep in mind, all this polishing only comes at the end. Now, some of you might have asked yourselves whether an outline fits into this process somewhere. And it certainly can if you like. I'm not going to go into depth on it today. But if you do want to write an outline, I'd recommend putting it in between draft half and draft 1. Now, this also depends on whether you're working in the hard sciences or the humanities, and also depends on the field you're in. I find that in the hard sciences, outlines are usually not as necessary, because if you're writing a scientific paper, the general structure of the paper is already given for you, and you need to fill in the sections, so to speak. But if you're writing in the humanities, outlines are often essential. If you're writing in philosophy or history, for example, you actually have to figure out from a macro perspective what you think and what you're going to say in your paper. So an outline would be very helpful there. And there are 2 different techniques you could use. One is called a sentence outline, where you actually write out in full sentences all the different points that you're going to make. This can be a very effective technique if you want to test yourself to really see if you understand what you think you understand. When you have to write something out in a full sentence, you often find that you don't really understand it as well as you thought you did. So this can be a good technique if you're still unsure about what you're going to say. Or alternatively, you could use a topic outline where you merely write down key words or bullet points, where you give yourself an overall frame of where you're going to go in your paper. So the most important thing to keep in mind about this 2.5 draft method is it's a technique to help you always stay in the flow. So you never have writer's block. You always know what you can do next in your writing process. And I want you to think about this as a general frame that you then have to tweak to whatever you're working on. So for you, it might not be the 2.5 draft method. It might be the 6.5 draft method or the 4.5 draft method, whatever fits for you. The point is to learn how to make a mess with your ideas and then clean them up. And you might find that different phases actually take a couple of subdrafts, right? In draft 1, you might end up having draft 1.2, 1.3. And you might even find, once you get into draft 2 or draft 1, you have to then scrap whatever you thought and go back to the beginning to draft half, because you Only once you got into figuring out the logical flow of ideas, only then you realize, wait, actually this topic isn't even the right one, and you have to go back to the beginning. So play with this technique and figure out what works best for you. So this concludes the presentation about the writing process. Thank you very much for listening, and see you next time.